Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a case today that a lot of you requested. It's the story of Kaylee McMullen from Norman, Oklahoma.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Initially, it seemed pretty straightforward, like an open and shut kind of thing. But as we started digging deeper, things got complicated and dark.
Really dark.
Kaylee was, from what we can tell, a well-loved young woman. Cheerleader, studying to be an EMT, and then she's found dead.
And it's her own father who calls 911, Ronald McMullen.
Right. And that 911 call, talk about a red flag. He's so calm, it's almost eerie, like he's rehearsed it or something.
It's interesting, right? Because you'd think in a moment of such intense stress, someone's true self would kind of come out, you know what I mean?
Totally. Drop the act.
Exactly.
So the police arrive at the McMullen house, and it's chaos, of course. Kaylee's body, Ronald's shirt, is covered in blood. His wife, Karen, is desperately trying to do CPR.
But Ronald, instead of, being totally beside himself with grief, he's focused on washing the blood off his shirt.
And then covering himself in dirt. Like, what?
Yeah. It's almost like he's trying to create a specific scene, a narrative, to throw off suspicion.
Trying to make it look like he was involved in some kind of struggle outside, maybe.
Maybe. But as the investigators dig deeper, things get even stranger.
The autopsy report, for instance, it basically rules out suicide right away. Kaylee was shot from too far away.
Right, suggesting there was some sort of struggle.
They did find some gunpowder residue on her hands.
But not enough to suggest she'd fired the gun, more like she'd tried to defend herself. Block it, maybe.
So we've got a crime scene that doesn't quite add up, a father acting strangely. Where do the investigators go next?
We start looking into Kaylee and Ronald's relationship. Phone records, texts, that sort of thing.
And that's when they start to uncover this really disturbing pattern. It's called coercive control, for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term.
It's basically a form of domestic abuse, where the abuser uses tactics like intimidation, isolation, and surveillance to exert power over the victim. It can be really subtle, but incredibly damaging.
So these text messages between Kaylee and her dad, wow, he was tracking her every move, demanding she be home by a certain time, telling her who she could and couldn't see.
It's classic abuser behavior, trying to isolate her, control every aspect of her life.
And Kaylee's messages, they're just heartbreaking. She's clearly scared of him, uncomfortable with his behavior. She even uses words like creeped out.
But he would just deny everything, downplay her concerns. It's another tactic abusers use: gaslighting, making the victim question their own reality, their own sanity.
He even called himself a fact finder. Can you believe that? As if he had the right to invade her privacy and monitor her every move.
It's all about control, shifting the blame, making the victim feel like they're the one in the wrong.
So manipulative, so insidious. And in Kaylee's case, it went beyond emotional abuse. There's evidence that the abuse turned physical.
Oh, yeah. And that's where the trial gets really interesting. We start to hear from people who knew Kaylee and Ronald, and their testimonies paint a truly disturbing picture.
We'll dive into those testimonies in just a bit. Stay with us. This deep dive is about to get a whole lot more intense.
So the trial starts, and it really becomes this platform where people close to Kaylee and Ronald are forced to, confront the truth about their relationship.
And it gets pretty intense, right?
Yeah. We hear from friends, family, even Kaylee's ex-boyfriend.
Yeah.
And their testimonies are like pieces of a puzzle, slowly revealing what was really going on.
Give us an example. Who was one of the key witnesses?
Well, Sonia Hester. She was really close to Kaylee, since they were kids. And she described this really scary incident where Ronald got physically violent with Kaylee. They were arguing, and he just, snapped and was actually Kaylee's mom, Karen, who had to step in and stop him.
So this wasn't just controlling text messages. This was actual physical abuse.
Right. And Sonia's testimony really shatters this image Ronald was trying to project, the loving dad. It shows a much darker side to him.
Makes you wonder what else was happening in that house, If he could do that in front of her friend.
Right. Chilling, isn't it?
So then we have Paul Sargent, Kaylee's ex-boyfriend. He testifies too, right?
Yeah. And his testimony is interesting because he's kind of an outsider looking in. He gives a different perspective.
And what does he have to say?
He says Kaylee called him during that same incident Sonia described. She was really upset, obviously. And he backs up Sonia's story, says that Karen had to actually threaten Ronald with a weapon to protect Kaylee.
Wait, what? So Karen knew about the abuse?
Seems like it. And that makes her testimony during the trial even more confusing because she denies everything.
Okay, hold on. We need to talk about Karen's testimony later because that is a whole other can of worms. But there was another witness, right? Megan Swan.
Oh, yeah. Megan was Kaylee's cheer partner. And she gives this really unsettling picture of Ronald.
What do you mean?
She remembers him like always encouraging underage drinking, especially pressuring Kaylee to drink, even though she was, way too young.
Like, why? What was his goal there?
I think it was all about control, blurring the lines, putting her in situations where he had power over her.
Okay, that's starting to make sense. And did Megan corroborate the abuse claims?
Yeah, she said Kaylee confided in her about what was going on. So we've got multiple people outside the family, friends, and ex-boyfriend all testifying to this pattern of abuse.
At this point, it seems like they've got a mountain of evidence against Ronald.
You'd think so, right. But then Karen takes the stand, and her testimony throws everything into question.
This is the part I just can't wrap my head around. After everything we've heard, she gets up there and denies everything.
Yeah, she completely denies the allegations of abuse, even contradicts Sonia and Paul about the incident where she had to intervene. It's like she's trying to protect Ronald, even after he's been accused of murdering their daughter.
I mean, is that even possible? Like, psychologically, what could be going on there? Was she afraid of him? Or was it some kind of, denial?
Well, there are a few theories about what might be happening with Karen. Some experts suggest it could be a form of Stockholm syndrome, where she's developed this loyalty to her abuser.
That's intense.
It is. Or maybe it was just complete denial, like she couldn't face the reality of what was happening in her own home. It's hard to say for sure.
So Karen's testimony introduces this whole new layer of complexity to the case. Did the prosecution have anything to counter that?
They did, and it's a big one. Get this. As the officers are leaving the McMullen house that morning, right after they find Kaylee, they overhear Ronald say something to his wife.
What did he say?
He said, "I did that."
Whoa. Talk about a bombshell.
Right. I mean, it's pretty incriminating. The prosecution argued that it was a clear confession, a moment of honesty where Ronald just slipped up. But of course, the defense tried to spin it.
How did they try to spin that?
They said he was just expressing remorse, not admitting to murder, typical defense tactic, create doubt, offer alternative explanations, anything to protect their client.
But with everything else stacked against him, did they have any other evidence to support that claim?
Not really. The prosecution had built a pretty solid case, and then they hit the defense with one final blow.
What was that?
They presented a 2009 affidavit that accused Ronald of taking advantage of Kaylee when she was just 14 years old.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it's awful. And it suggests that the abuse had been going on for much longer than anyone realized.
So we have a confession, a history of abuse spanning years, and all this circumstantial evidence. It seems pretty clear-cut at this point.
It does. And the jury agreed. After 2 weeks of deliberation, they found Ronald McMullen guilty of first-degree murder.
And he was sentenced to life in prison.
Life without parole.
So Ronald McMullen is behind bars, justice served, right? But it still feels like there are so many unanswered questions, and the people left behind, they're the ones who have to live with the fallout of all this.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, a guilty verdict doesn't just magically erase the pain and trauma.
Yeah.
Especially for Karen. I mean, can you imagine? First, your daughter is murdered, and then you find out it was your husband who did it.
It's unfathomable. And then on top of that, she spent the whole trial defending him.
It's, well, there are a lot of psychological theories about why someone might do that. Maybe she was in denial, couldn't process the truth.
Or maybe she was afraid of him, even after everything.
Possibly. Or, and this is a tough one, maybe it was a form of Stockholm syndrome, where a victim starts to identify with their abuser, develops this twisted sense of loyalty.
Gosh, that's heavy. So many layers to unpack.
Definitely. And honestly, we may never fully understand Karen's motivations. But one thing's for sure, she's a victim in all this, too. She's carrying a lot of pain, a lot of trauma, probably a ton of guilt as well.
It's hard to even imagine. And then there's Kaylee's friends, all those people whose lives she touched. They lost someone so young, so full of potential.
It's just senseless. And it reminds us that, a crime like this, it doesn't just affect the immediate victim. It creates this ripple effect of pain that spreads outward, touches everyone in their orbit.
For sure. This whole case, it really shines a light on how insidious domestic abuse can be, especially coercive control. It can be so hard to spot, even for people who are close to the situation.
That's why it's so important to educate ourselves about the different forms of abuse. Not just physical violence, but emotional manipulation too. Gaslighting, isolation, all of it.
And we have to create a culture where survivors feel safe to come forward, right? Where they know they'll be believed and supported.
Absolutely. Because too often people don't want to see it. They dismiss the victim's concerns, make excuses for the abuser, and that can have devastating consequences, as we saw with Kaylee.
This has been a tough deep dive for sure, full of twists and turns and just a whole lot of heartache.
Yeah. But I think it's an important conversation to have. Kaylee's story is a reminder that we have to stay vigilant, look out for each other, and always believe survivors.
Absolutely. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, please reach out for help. There are resources available. You don't have to go through this alone.
And remember, Kaylee's legacy doesn't have to be defined by tragedy. We can honor her memory by working to prevent this from happening to someone else, by speaking up, by supporting survivors, by creating a world where abuse isn't tolerated.
Well said. Thank you all for joining us for this deep dive. We know it was heavy, but we hope it was also informative, maybe even empowering in some way. Stay safe out there, everyone, and we'll see you next time.